Right, good morning, everyone. It's 10 o'clock, so we'll go ahead and get started. People will continue to sign on, and that is totally fine. Thanks for joining us today, especially those of you who are making time on your summer break. We really appreciate you spending a little bit of time with us this morning. My name is Christy Ganya, and I'm a program manager with the Telehealth ROCKS program. Telehealth ROCKS is a federally funded program that focuses on school-based behavioral health, and we do this in a couple of different ways by working on social determinants, supporting school-based services, and elementary trainings just like this one. So we're glad you're here for this session on trauma-responsive schools. And if we can go to the next slide, we'll review just a couple of notes before we get started. This session is being recorded and we will send it to you afterwards. Your microphones have been muted. Feel free anytime though to use the chat or unmute to ask questions. And then please make sure that your first and last name are visible on your Zoom screen. That helps us track attendance. Next slide, please. We don't have any project disclosures and just wanted to assure you that the information presented today is evidence-based and it's what's currently acceptable as best practice. And then after the session, we'll send the resource email with the slides, the recording, and any of the other resource links that are mentioned. Just to note, it does take us a little bit to process the recording, so watch for it, not quite immediately after the session, but a little bit later this week. We also will send you certificates of attendance that will include the hours that you attended for both sessions, and those will come to your email. And then lastly, if you have any questions that we didn't get answered, feel free to email us at any time. And then I will pass it to Melissa to start introductions and begin our presentation.
Wonderful. Thank you, Christy. So good Wednesday morning. I am Melissa Maris. I see a lot of familiar faces and names. We are delighted that you have joined us for what is the third of kind of a 3-session series. Then they stand alone, but also I know several of you all have been here for the duration in June. Just to orient to time and place, we are almost to July. So July starts on Saturday. So we hope that you and yours are having a wonderful summer so far, and we're super duper excited to be here to talk to you again about trauma responsive schools. Just by way of introductions, I am a clinical community psychologist. I'm based out of Columbia, Missouri, and have been doing this work statewide in Missouri for about 15 years, and have been working with Evelyn and her team with Kansas and other schools for the last 3 years about. And Evelyn, do you want to say good morning and hello?
Thanks, Melissa. So I'm Evelyn Nelson. I'm a child psychologist at the University of Kansas Medical Center and really fortunate to work with our Telehealth ROCKS team. So welcome, everybody. Thanks for joining today.
Fantastic. Okay, so what are we doing here and where are we in this series? So this is our third session of these 3 trauma responsive school sessions we've done this month. We started off way back at the beginning of June with an introduction presentation that really went over kind of what we consider to be the foundations of trauma responsive schools. And then last week, we started these 2, what we're calling kind of advanced sessions, really to discuss components and implementation of a trauma responsive school plan. So last week, we focused kind of big picture, talking about assessing strengths, getting ready, resourcing for the adults. And today we're going to shift and focus more on kind of how we might plan or prepare for events, and then address components of a trauma responsive schools among individuals. And then we'll do a little bit of wrap up right at the end. So just as a reminder, if you were there and if not, this is a sneak preview. Everything is recorded, and so you can always go back and snag the recordings and the materials. Really, our goal here in terms of takeaway is that we give this away. That's kind of a key component of echoes in general. So please take a look at this if you haven't had a chance. In the introduction, we talked about trauma responsive schools in the context of school mental health and focusing on school mental health, not just school mental illness. So really thinking about how we are building skills, promoting skills, building health and a healthy context for young people to grow and learn, and also having on that continuum, of course, supports for our friends who are struggling and need more supports, and the role of trauma responsive schools in that work. We also talked about our brains and how learning about our brains is important, that it's helpful to learn how young people's brains work, but also how our brains work, and talked through some different components of that, some different tools, and then really concluded that session by talking about how a really important first step for schools is to revisit all the great things you're already doing that really align with a trauma responsive schools approach. So the example I often give is about consistency and routine. So the more that we can make environments consistent and predictable, the better off all of us are, particularly young people who are struggling either with mental health issues or with trauma, but really just good for all of us to have these consistent, predictable environments. And schools, just by the way that they're set up, are actually very consistent and predictable environments. And so we concluded this introductory section by really celebrating what you're already doing and what all schools are already doing, and launching into the next two sessions, these advanced kind of areas of focus. So last week, as we were kind of shifting to focus on sort of a big picture, kind of how schools can get started, we revisited kind of what it looks like, practically speaking, to revisit strengths, and talked about how talking about what already is in place is a great way to gain traction and buy-in. We know that schools are often inundated with new initiatives, new programs, new practices, new policies, which can be great. That can be an opportunity to embrace innovation and change and improvement. But we want to make sure that we're keeping the stuff that already exists and celebrating that, acknowledging that. And that can be a great way to really kind of start conversations in the school building, school district. We talked about how it's important to be trauma responsive in the way that we go about becoming more trauma responsive. To that end, appreciating that we all have brains, we are all learners, we're all humans. And so if we want the adults in a school context to reflect on their behavior, change their behaviors in some way, we also have to appreciate that they are human as well and have their own set of experiences. And so that really, this is one of the lovely things about trauma responsive approaches is there's so much of this that is universal for everybody. And so really getting down to the foundations of that, if we treat our colleagues and other adults and respect them as humans, that also that can translate to how we can really transform school contexts. And then we concluded last week by spending a good chunk of time talking about resourcing for adults. And so the idea that part of being trauma responsive is making sure that we have available resources for any of our friends who are struggling. And so we talked about some specific resources and then concluded with a little bit of a deeper dive into the role of self-care and resilience in a trauma responsive approach in schools. Self-care is not a new topic for any of us. And some of us kind of have a visceral reaction at this point to being told that we should be doing more self-care. So we tried to reframe that. This is part of being human and adulting, is that we are always trying to figure out ways that we can focus on rejuvenating ourselves and that we have, a really full set of tools in our toolbox to, just interact and to be present in daily life. So what are we going to talk about today? Today we've already done that first bullet. Yay! So we already talked about what we've already done. And today we're going to do a deeper dive into planning for events and individuals. So we're going to talk a little bit about what it means to have a tiered approach within a trauma responsive schools kind of conceptualization. We're going to talk a little bit about psychological first aid. And in these first two bullets, we're going to be sharing a lot of resources of things that we've talked about in the past in more depth. And again, as Christy mentioned, we will be sending out the video and links and other pieces, and she's going to be dropping them in the chat. Don't feel like you have to grab them from the chat, that they will all be coming out again But really the take home message here is that we have a lot of good resources. And if any of this sounds really interesting, if you get lost trying to find the resource, please let us know. The purpose here is to give this away. And so if you can't get it, then we are not succeeding. So let us know. We would love to share that information with you. So after we kind of talk through those pieces, we're going to talk a little bit more about brains again, and as a way to kind of think through why we talk about things like psychological first aid in these whole school, whole community approaches. And then we're going to transition into focusing on kind of more individual planning or different strategies that might be used. And how we might consider either evaluating existing strategies to see how they could be strengthened or to try to maybe figure out why something's not working the way we think it should be. And also kind of an approach to adopting or considering new strategies. And then we'll do a little bit of wrap up. So just as kind of launching into this, when we think about trauma responsive schools and really the idea of becoming more trauma responsive humans, I always in my brain think, when things are getting elevated, whether it's, me in my own house with my children, or even just, in the grocery store and someone's having a tough time in front of me in the checkout lane, there's part of my brain that just is screaming like, calm down, like just calm down, everybody calm down. So that doesn't work, right? So telling somebody to calm down when they don't feel calm is not going to work. So when I have that sort of running playlist in my head, I try to take a deep breath. And then I think about really, really practical things that I can do to help myself be calm, because I know that if I am calm, if I'm regulated, if I'm grounded, then my brain is actually going to work better. And then it seems like everything might be a little bit easier if I can access the things that I know exist in my brain. But that means that I have to be calm myself. And so this is just one visual, this idea of a rainbow walk. Many of you all have probably seen this or used this. These are the kinds of tools that, this seems like it might be more geared toward an elementary age student, but actually these kinds of tools work for all of us. I don't know if you all know about De-Stress Monday. It's a great campaign, lots of free resources, a lot of great content that can be easily packaged and shared, reshared in lots of different formats. It's this kind of stuff. It's, these GIFs and memes and visuals and kind of very practical, tangible strategies that actually work for everybody. And so just by kind of walking through the colors of the rainbow, taking your eyes and finding something in the room that is red and then orange, yellow, green, blue, purple, it does actually calm our bodies down and makes it so that we are better able to engage with other humans. We're better able to access our brains. It means that we can remember better, we can recall better, we're better, logical thinkers, we can think through processes. So this is kind of just the obligatory reminder that, please take advantage of all these kinds of tools as we're talking through this content today, whatever it is that you use to kind of bring yourself back into the present moment. That's great. Keep practicing those things. We love hearing what you are doing for yourself or in your classroom or whatever context you're working in, to kind of, regularly do this kind of practice, to kind of make sure that you're grounded and the people around you are also able to be present and accessing those different resources. Okay, so tiered approaches. This is part of a triangle. I feel like it's hard to talk about school mental health without putting a triangle on the screen. And so this is just part of a triangle. So I don't know that this counts, and it's not colored like a stoplight. So I feel like we get some points for something there. But the idea of a tiered approach to anything and a tiered approach in schools is really based on the public health model. And the same the same reason we use tiered approaches for all kinds of things applies to trauma and being a trauma responsive school as well. The idea of a public health model is that in the end, we are more efficient and effective if we start first by thinking about what everybody needs to kind of day to day be functional, be productive, be kind, be present, that we start there. We start with those strategies and those efforts in any context to try to start with that foundation. The stronger that foundation is, the easier and better everything else is. And so even when we're talking about trauma responsive schools, I think a natural inclination is, at least for me, is I immediately go to a picture in my head of an individual child That individual child is often a young friend who is struggling with a lot of different things, may have experienced really difficult things in their life, may actually still be in a chaotic home environment or struggling with different pieces. And I think the thing to remember is that when we're talking about public health approaches, certainly a tiered approach to trauma responsive schools, is that that young friend who may have a lot of different needs still benefits a lot from these universal whole school, whole community approaches. Everybody benefits when we know more about mental health, when we know more about trauma. So when we think about preparing for events or things we can do now to strengthen our toolbox, to build our toolbox for what may or may not happen in the future, kind of considering these primary prevention, these promotion efforts is really, really critical. So when we're thinking about trauma responsive schools and primary prevention, what we're talking about here really is a whole lot of things, including psychological first aid, which we're going to jump into in a minute. When we think about secondary prevention, so these are additional supports that some youth, some families, some folks in the community might need beyond what we're offering to everybody. That's going to be something like skills for psychological recovery, other kinds of interventions or resources that are still pretty general and universal, but then are targeted for specific folks who have either just gone through something really difficult. There's been a disaster or something that people know about. There's been a car crash, something that's existing in public. That's where kind of these secondary prevention kinds of efforts kind of might come into play. And then, of course, we are thinking about the full continuum. So what if we're doing something like psychological first aid? We have that, kind of in our back pocket. We've identified, friends who might need some additional support, and we're putting those things in place. But still, we're seeing some additional needs that need to be addressed. That's really when we move to something like trauma-focused CBT, parent-child interaction therapy, some of the really more focused, intensive kinds of treatments, but they all kind of go together. One kind of misstep or, well-intended misstep that I see a lot of folks doing is, we start talking about trauma, we ourselves start to get a little bit kind of revved up, and immediately we go to the very top of the triangle and focus on those resources, those interventions, and we kind of think, oh, if we can just get TFCBT in the school, then everything's going to be better. So is it going to be helpful to get additional resources in your school? Sure, absolutely. And TFCBT might be a great resource for a number of young people and families you work with. It will be better across the board if you have the rest of the triangle in place. And TFCBT is not going to be the solution post a natural disaster, right? There's just going to be too many people who have too many needs to be able to, pull everybody out for this, more singular focused kind of intervention. That's part of the reason we start at the bottom and work our way up. So we wanted to touch a little bit on psychological first aid, kind of as I previewed in the agenda slide. We actually did, I think a couple years ago now, a series on psychological first aid, and that's recorded and available. I thought it went really well. I learned a ton presenting with my colleagues around this topic. And the great news about psychological first aid is there are a lot of available resources, totally free, very handy. And so just wanted to kind of comment on psychological first aid. Again, deep dives are available elsewhere. Psychological first aid is an evidence-informed intervention, and it's really there to be available kind of right away. It's meant to be a real-time resource. We cannot predict all the things that are going to happen in the future, of course. And so this is a great kind of tool and set of resources that I think all people in schools, all people in communities really should know about and have access to, because it's just really useful and handy. Evelyn.
Thanks for that summary. I just, we recently presented on psychological first aid, and all you were saying just reminded me, folks may know about psychological first aid in response to disaster, but I know we really used it in response to the pandemic and more a public health crisis. And just a lot of the strategies have remained really useful across community stresses. So I just wanted to add that in.
I love it. Thank you, Evelyn. Yeah, and that's a really great point. And I see the Can Do disaster outreach down in the corner. This was a real aha for me, actually, of learning more about um, some of the resources that are coming out of and have been developed in under this umbrella of disaster psychology, which are fabulous. And there's so much good stuff there. All too often, we are developing resources kind of in these little buckets, and then we don't see how they connect. And absolutely, Evelyn, that's a really, really great thing to point out is there's a lot of good stuff that's coming out of disasters, psychology that can be used in all kinds of contexts. And I love a generalizable tool. So something that is, a good set of easy to use resources that can be used in all kinds of ways. And so absolutely, that was a huge aha for me is, oh, that's right. So these things that we think about to use after there's a tornado, it's actually really helpful when something else happens, the pandemic, even some of the social justice issues that have come out, that absolutely there's a lot of pieces to this that are foundational that make a lot of sense. So PFA, practical, very handy. It can be used by anybody. So it's really easy to give away. It can be very, very limited. And really, I think of as just kind of when we're thinking about what we should do when something hard happens, the psychological first aid. There's a lot of good resources there. And the link all available online. There's a manual, there's tools, there's worksheets. And so when we kind of think about psychological first aid, a couple of things that have come up as we've talked about psychological first aid that I think are helpful to point out. One is that psychological first aid is different than mental health first aid. So a lot of times, even when we were preparing for and doing our psychological first aid series, there's a lot of confusion between the two, which makes sense because two of the words are the same. So mental health first aid is really an effort to promote mental health literacy, and it focuses on what we can do when we are recognizing that either a person is developing a mental health issue, that there's a worsening mental health problem, or that they're in a mental health crisis. And there are all kinds of versions of mental health first aid that have also evolved. So there's youth mental health first aid, mental health first aid for all kinds of different contexts. And especially in both Missouri and Kansas, there has been a lot of deployment of mental health first aid. So it's very common for people to be familiar with mental health first aid. There's nothing conflicting about any of these pieces. It's just a little bit of a different focus. We like mental health first aid and support it and promote it. Psychological first aid is something distinct from that, and it really is focused on helping people in the aftermath of a trauma or a disaster. I also just wanted to briefly touch on psychological debriefing because it often comes up when we talk about psychological first aid. So psychological debriefing, there's a lot of similarities between psychological debriefing and PFA. With psychological debriefing, there is a much greater focus on the debriefing part, right? It's right there in the title. There's an emphasis on discussing the details of what happened and really talking about the emotional response. And what the research is now showing us, and there's a growing body of literature really supporting this, is that psychological debriefing can be beneficial for a lot of different folks in a lot of different contexts. What we're also seeing is that it actually can make things worse for some people. And if we think about what happens right after, say, a tornado or there's a large disaster, when we gather people together in a small group and talk about what happened in detail, and then talk about how difficult it was, everybody's different responses, we're actually creating a setting that could even re-traumatize folks. A lot of times when we are bringing folks together into that psychological debriefing space, individuals themselves have not had the time or space to build their own resources to even revisit some of these pieces. And so we, of course, are not in any way saying that psychological debriefing is bad or good in either direction. But again, these fields are evolving. And so as we learn more, we share that. And as we know better, we can do better. So just wanted to point that out. So psychological first aid, why are we talking about this? And I'm going to come right back to the brain. We all have brains, and we talked about this in our first session and talked about the hand, the hand model and how that's a useful way to kind of think about how our brains work and other people's brains work. There's a video. I really encourage folks, if you haven't, become familiar with the hand model specifically and think about ways you can use it. It is probably one of the top 3 things when we talk about brains and trauma that I use all the time. It's easy. It helps me remember. It helps me communicate. My children know the hand model. I mean, and people teach the hand model in their schools. It really is a good foundational tool. Part of the reason that it is so helpful is because when we start talking about psychological first aid, trauma responsive anything for anybody, it is all going to come back to the brain. It is brain, and we all have brains. And so kind of understanding those 2 fundamental pieces is really quite essential. We talked a little bit last week about trauma responses and how we all have kind of our own unique trauma response that often falls into one of these 4 categories. So fight, flight, freeze, and fawn. And often we know what our trauma response is. Knowing what our trauma response is, or even just knowing that they exist, knowing they might be in play, is an important tool no matter what we're talking about related to trauma. It's helpful for the grown-ups to be aware of their trauma responses and to kind of come to that place with acceptance and validation. Oftentimes we cannot control our trauma responses. What we can do is be aware of them and be aware of what it looks like, what it sounds like, and how we can manage ourselves in moments, and so that we can then try to be aware of our behaviors and what we can do, and then we can help other people be aware of theirs. And I did just want to hit on this just a little bit further, because I do feel like still, and this has been consistent for the last 7 years that we've been talking a lot more about trauma-informed, trauma-responsive spaces, that this conversation around trauma responses or even triggers comes up a lot. And so the questions of, well, what is a trigger? You're a trigger, I'm a trigger, everybody's a trigger. And we just use this word a lot. The word trigger has now become triggering in a lot of different ways because of the way that we use it. And so I wanted to talk just about this briefly, because what we know from the research again and again is that triggers are real, and this is real. It's happening in our brain. It's something that we cannot control in terms of the response inside of us. What we can think about are the behaviors then that result from that. And the example that seems to resonate with a lot of folks, and especially this time of year, is that we're coming up on July 4th, and there are a lot of fireworks. And so, probably about 10 years ago, certainly by 5 years ago, around this time, I started seeing a lot more signs popping up, hey, we have, veterans live here, just be aware, right? And so when I think about triggers and trigger responses and what we can do around them, I think about that a lot of times what we're talking about is, or even a trigger warning and things like that. It's not that we are ever going to remove all of the things that are triggering to all the people. That's impossible. And that's not the aim. What we're trying to do is just help people be aware of it and think about what we can do. So I can be aware of what is happening when I'm setting off a firework. I can be aware of that, and I can just consider it. It doesn't mean I have to change anything, but what it does mean is that I can be aware of it and I can consider it in a different kind of way. And it helps me to think about kind of what's happening in the brain when that trauma response is happening, is that, we have this stress, and then our brains get confused, and they can't discern current danger, present danger from past danger. And so when I'm in that trauma response, immediately something happens, and then my brain can't tell the difference. And the thing is that it doesn't matter if the danger is real in that moment. What matters is that it feels real to me, and my brain is going to react like it's real no matter what. And so telling people that something is not really dangerous or really scary doesn't help, because the brain is confused. And so that's why a lot of times these kinds of, let's take a deep breath, let's give it some time, right? We're trying to regulate and kind of get back to a different place so that we can access the rest of our brains. And then we can really discern, is this really currently dangerous, or am I confusing the two? And now that I'm in a calmer place, I can really discern that. So kind of just wanted to raise that. And then Evelyn is going to talk to us a little bit more about kind of some of what we're learning about how our brains actually are responding when different pieces are happening, which is always fascinating. So Evelyn, I'll hand this over to you.
Thanks, Melissa. I wanted to share these slides. My students just love these slides. It's kind of the idea we can see this measurably when we do brain activity scans. We really do see these shifts in the brain. So I think that helps get kind of our mind around that it's a real tangible thing. It's good to remember these shifts. That it doesn't mean we can't use strategies to reshift to a more calm place. But we do really, again, when we look at brain changes, we can see those in at KU we have the ultra fancy brain scan machine, but I think it is kind of useful to remember that the shifts are real. I wanted to use an analogy. Some of you may know that I live with a 17-year-old who just loves his car more than anything in the world. So I get a lot of instruction from him about how manual transmissions and gear shifted cars are just so much better. And I want to use that example here. So kind of thinking about our brains in this setting where, we're just kind of driving along in the car, everything's smooth in fifth gear. And then suddenly something runs across the street. And so we'll go to the next slide. When something runs out, our brain is just kind of like our car. It shifts down from fifth gear to first gear really fast. We go into that how do I react and just keep myself safe mode, and kind of more driven by our brainstem and kind of our survival mode. Next slide. So with that, our brain at that point, it really, just like the car, downshifts really fast. And it's an opportunity then for us to use the strategies we've been talking about throughout this series, kind of talking to ourselves about being safe and calm, using the grounding strategies, using things from PFA that kind of help shift us from that alarm place that we see that our brain kind of goes to back to the calm space. So kind of reminding ourselves, oh, that wasn't a saber-toothed tiger that just ran across the street. We can calm down, everything's okay. And then kind of slowly gear ourselves back up to kind of function in that calm and alert phase. So I'll turn it back over to you, Melissa.
Awesome. Thanks, Evelyn. And I love that you highlighted I love the example, and also love that you highlighted that your students often resonate with this. This is another piece of, especially when we're talking about brains, I would say that it's true for a whole lot of things. But my experience has been that when we are talking about brains, often we need to say the same information in several different ways with slightly different graphics, until it really connects. And I love this, and you can start to see developmentally, and different people, if they connect with different things, I think that's fabulous. The end goal is that everybody kind of gets it. And to me, it's just, I love it. And how clear it makes me think of, and I'm sure we've all had this experience of, watching, a grown adult kind of melt down and then start to act in ways that seem much, much, much younger. So even, not even adult to adolescent, but like adult to on the ground, curled up in the fetal position, rocking, crying, sucking their thumb. And like that, okay, so that's the behavior we're looking at. That's coming from somewhere. And that could be related to this exact graphic, right? That's what's happening. It reminds me of we talked the very first introductory section or session about using our bodies and being really careful of movement, being aware of kind of how our bodies look and feel and how we're presenting. And also this idea, and I connect it with this, that, when we see people elevating and getting bigger, one of the things that we can do is not to make ourselves smaller, but to make ourselves appear smaller by even just stepping back, right? How, that's how our visual field changes, is if someone steps back, they're automatically going to seem smaller because they're not going to be as big, right? And so things like that we can adjust, even those small pieces. And that, as Evelyn was saying, that we have brain scans and can show that these things happen. And so there are these physiological responses. Kind of what I try to remind myself is that we should meet people with our behavior, we should meet them where they are with their behavior developmentally, no matter how old they are. So if they're 15, but they're acting like they're 5, then treat them as if they are a 5-year-old, and not in a way that's disrespectful or diminutive or shaming in any way, but just, okay, what would I say in this moment to a 5-year-old? What needs does that 5-year-old have? And to me, this is all very connected to PFA, and just reminder of things that, many of us often do these things just naturally. And some people need to learn, and that's okay too. But meeting people where they are and making sure that that safety is there, and then building up. And that's really, this is a snip of the field operations guide for PFA. These are the core actions. So the 8 core actions. PFA is designed so that you can use any of these actions at any time. And it's more like a menu of, okay, in this moment, what do I think, what can I do to be useful? How can I be helpful? How can I help the people I'm with or the person I'm with? And so what we're talking about here with brain and safety and developmental levels is really about safety and comfort. At the end of the day, we talked about this last week, safety first, safety first, safety first. If I don't feel safe, the rest of it doesn't really matter. My brain cannot process the information if I don't feel safe. And that's not an I won't brain, that's an I can't brain. I can't move forward until I feel safe. And that's the way our brains are designed, which is great. That helps us be responsive and to keep ourselves safe. What it also can do is paralyze us if we are in a space where we don't feel safe. So again, big shout out to PFA. We really have enjoyed using it and sharing it in different contexts. And we have, the links that Chrissy shared about that the past presentations. PFA is totally free. It's available online. There is a really nice mobile app. I have it right here on my phone. There's PFA right there. It's on my phone. You can't really see it, but it's really nice and very handy. And so one of the things, you can download it, you can have it on your phone, and then once you get into the app, immediately you'll see a lot of different things that you can choose. I really like this survivor stress reactions. It's one of the first components that pops up that you can connect with. So I'm going to click on survivor stress reactions, and then it takes me to adults, adolescents, school age, infants, and then it just immediately gives me information of, okay, what does a stress reaction look like for an adolescent? Because maybe I've spent all day working with elementary age students, and I know that adolescents are different than elementary age students, but I just maybe need a little bit of a reminder. And that's okay, because I have a brain and I need a reminder. And so look, it's right here on my phone, it's free. And so PFA has now become absolutely one of my go-tos of things that I share. Also, if you are not familiar with the National Child Traumatic Stress Network, that's another one to keep in your back pocket and refer to often. So they have an incredible searchable resource database online, and you can find all kinds of things for all kinds of topics. NCTSN also does a really nice job translating some of their main resources that are particularly popular into lots of different languages. And it's something that really stands out. We love NCTSN and would highly, highly encourage you to check it out. They really do have a lot of very specialized resources for things around trauma that I could never anticipate. So very specific situations. And it's, hey, guess what? Somebody has developed a handout with these same basic concepts, but adapted for this particular population in this context around this. I mean, just all the things. I love it when we don't have to recreate the wheel. Somebody already has it. And NCTSN definitely does a great job of storing those things and making them easily available. Okay, so PFA is great. And we're going to shift a little bit and talk about strategies. We're going to spend a little bit of time talking about strategies and walking through some. But one of the interesting experiences that I've had in doing a lot of this trauma-related kinds of professional developments and talks, over the last 5-10 years, is this ongoing challenge where I'll come in, I'll talk about trauma-informed, trauma-responsive pieces, share some strategies, and then the feedback almost always is more strategies. I want more strategies. Can you give us more strategies, Melissa? Melissa, thank you for the 300 things you sent us. We want more. We want more strategies. And I get it. I get the desire for more and more strategies. But I think that there is a place where more strategies can be helpful, and sometimes when maybe that's not the trick. So I wanted to ask you all a question. It's a little bit of a silly question, but it does involve a Zoom poll, so I hope you all will engage and it'll be fun. And it really is a question. I need your help evaluating which one of these tools is better. So we have a screwdriver and we have a Q-tip, and I want you all to let me know which one you think is better. So go ahead and take a second and just vote. I gave you an easy out option if you're like, I don't want to play, and that's the but which one of these tools is better? Just want to validate our respondents. That's great. Okay, we're at 80% participation, so let's close our poll. Okay, so which tool is better? Screwdriver, Q-tip, or So what we see here is that screwdriver versus Q-tip, screwdriver came out ahead by a little bit. Some folks definitely said Q-tip is clearly the winner. And some folks just are confused why we're talking about screwdrivers and Q-tips, which is totally fair. So does somebody who voted for screwdriver want to unmute and say why they said screwdriver is better? Why did screwdriver, top your choices?
I chose screwdriver, but because it's the one that I utilize more than the Q-tip. And as long as I know when to utilize the screwdriver, it's better.
Amazing. That was such a good, concise, solid answer. I appreciate your considerate response there. What about Q-tip? Did anybody vote for Q-tip who wants to share why they voted for Q-tip? And if you can't unmute yourself or are choosing not to, totally fine if you want to put it in the chat.
I'll share.
Hey.
Very similar. I chose Q-tip because it's the one that I use the most. So I think it's very perspective based on like what serves you. And for me, a Q-tip serves me better than a screwdriver.
Fantastic. Love it. I think I'm trying, there we go. Okay. Also a very completely valid response, right? So of course the trick here is that neither one of them is better, right? It all depends on what the job is and what you need to do. And so they have different functions, different purposes. There are lots of different ways you can use both of them. But one thing for sure is that you don't want to mix them up. And so you want to know when to use each one. And it's great if you have both, but if you had one, that would be better than having none. And I think this is kind of sort of my perspective, and I think one that I encourage you all to consider around strategies is that one strategy is better than no strategy, but having one strategy that you can use that has a good likelihood of working is way better than having 300 strategies that you're not going to use and you're not sure if they're going to work. And so when it comes to strategies and being in a trauma responsive school, building trauma responsive behavior plans for students, helping your teachers develop their own strategies for being more trauma responsive, or even managing themselves. We can talk strategies all day long. What's going to work best is one, finding something that someone is actually going to use, something that can actually be implemented, something that's realistic, something that's acceptable, that's present, that people have on hand, that they can use, that they can actually access and use, that they know what to do with it. And also something that they're willing to do and also something that's likely to work, right? So we don't want to be trying to peddle strategies if they don't have a good likelihood of working. And so that kind of goes back way to the beginning slides when Christy was saying that what we share is the best of what we know from what science offers. And that's part of the value of looking to evidence-based strategies, strategies with practice-based evidence, things that people have used that seem to work. All of those things are fantastic. And so what I always encourage is, if you don't have any strategies, pick one. All of us have strategies, and I know that for sure. So if you have strategies, figure out which strategies you have, and then figure out how to use them and when to use them and how to generalize them. But this push towards more and more strategies, I actually think is about something else. And so, and that's also fine. And I want to validate those feelings as well. But this is a critical distinction. And just want to point that out before we launch in to talking about strategies. Evelyn. And before you say what you're going to say, I want to know which one you picked.
I picked the Q-tip for the same reason folks shared, that it's the one I have most in my environment. Nice.
Love it.
I love all that you've said, Melissa, and that folks shared. It just reminded me, both of these could look like a magic wand. I think remembering it's so hard when you have a student or a family right in your office or you're together. Like, we all want to decrease that suffering. And so it's just a reminder for me that neither one are magic wands. I know I've got caught up trying to find the perfect strategy or the perfect tool. So sometimes I start looking for that tool instead of using the tools I have in my toolbox. So it just reminded me of that when you were talking.
I love that. I love the magic wand piece too, because it does. And it even kind of looked like these are things that like my children might pick up and use and pretend that they are actually wands. And so, right, that there are no magic wands. A really great point there. And also, Evelyn, what was resonating with me when you were saying that is how human it is to, be in a situation where we are responding to suffering the very best way that we know how, which is, to fall back on what we know. And so absolutely, we want to help. And that's why we turn to strategy. That's what we're going to talk about is strategies next. And so we want to do that, but also there are no magic wands. And the real trick I have found with, especially working with young people who have experienced really difficult things or have kind of prolonged or repeated traumas, is that trauma is really tricky. It's confusing. It is one of those issues that, we might work for a really long time to find a strategy that works, and a long time. That means we might go through a whole lot of things that have worked for other people, but are not seeming to work in this case. And we might find something that works, and then all of a sudden it stops, which is incredibly frustrating. It is disheartening. But that's kind of the nature of this, is that because it's our brains are shifting and moving. It's just hard. It's hard to find a strategy that's going to work, even for one person for a prolonged period of time. Things shift over time. And so a lot of the trauma responsive kind of conversations I've had with, especially with veteran classroom teachers, what I hear from them is, I don't know what to do. I've done this for 20 years and it's worked. And now it's not working. And that's confusing. And that is absolutely confusing. If something's been working for a long time and all of a sudden it doesn't, it's natural to be confused, right? And so then that's a piece of this too, is that, more strategies, having those things on hand. What I like is just having a lot of options. This is also when I feel like I should say, when it comes to choosing strategies or switching strategies, it's helpful to remember kind of how we introduced solid foods to children, right? So, babies are born, they're drinking formula or milk, and at some point solids come into play. There's a lot of great pictures of kids around this time when they start eating. It's hilarious. It can be really frustrating and messy. But the thing is as we introduce solid foods, we don't all of a sudden just, hand, the 6-month or 9-month-old baby a pepperoni pizza and say, good luck, right? Like, we do it in stages and we do it one by one, so that we can figure out kind of what's going to work. Are there allergies? And we want to be careful of doing the same thing. We also don't want to abandon things too quickly. So some things take time to work. And so we just want to be methodical about it and systematic. I was thinking, Evelyn, about kind of the example you gave, that I think oftentimes when we think about trauma, especially any kind of behavior plan that we're trying to make trauma responsive, oftentimes we are working with young people and their families and a school team who's tried a lot. And maybe the situation has just gotten worse and worse and worse, and now is in a crisis kind of place. Our tendency is to just throw everything and the kitchen sink at the problem. This is no longer tolerable. This has to be resolved. There's a lot of suffering involved. So we're just going to do everything we possibly can. And that I understand that impulse and that desire to respond in that way. There's a lot of risk in just doing everything, because then even if it works, guess what? You have to keep doing everything, and it's never sustainable. And so introducing one thing at a time, trying to figure out what works, doing that experiment, having open conversations about, hey, we're going to try this. It might not work. Doing a lot of checking in becomes really critical. I love the magic wand thing, Evelyn. That's great. Okay, so let's talk about some sources of strategies. We wanted to highlight a couple of resources here, and then talk through a rubric that can be used to evaluate existing strategies and kind of figure out how trauma responsive are they, and also can be used to consider new policies, practices, programs. So there are a ton of strategies that have the word trauma probably combined with other words, but things that you can do or try in all kinds of different settings. I have really appreciated the value of things like Pinterest, Teachers Pay Teachers, open forums, social media, where folks are taking a strategy and then adapting it to their context, to show kind of how far the strategy can be pushed. So taking something like zones of regulation, or even like a mood meter or a feelings thermometer, and taking it and adapting it so that it can be music specific because it's a music classroom. Great. That's creative. Super. Right. So there's all kinds of examples that are out there of ways to adapt and make things work and to make them acceptable. There is no one best strategy, and there is no one strategy that is going to work best for everybody for all situations. So this tool that you see here is kind of a compendium of different strategies. It comes out of the Wisconsin Department of Public Instruction. Wisconsin and that particular agency really were front runners in developing a lot of really cool tools. The rubric we're going to share here in a minute is also from Wisconsin. What I really like about this tool is that it organizes the strategies based on these key areas that you see kind of going along the left. So it's things like academics, assessment, attendance. It's all the words that you would expect to show up in like a building or a district improvement plan. All those indicators, performance indicators that are often going to be collected at the state level and used for important things like funding and other kinds of decisions. It organizes them in that way. And so one of the ways that I've seen some buildings, districts approach their trauma responsive work is by looking at their existing improvement goals. So next year we want to improve attendance in our high school from X to X, right? We're going to focus in on attendance, or we're going to focus in on reading fluency, or whatever the thing is that is the primary focus. Everybody's focused on it. We have assessments and we're charting and monitoring it. Fantastic. Start there and then build on that. Because the thing is that any kind of trauma responsive strategy you use, if it's helping people show up and be present when they're there, it's going to help everything. And so, yes, an attendance goal can be served by a trauma responsive strategy. And this kind of organizes that in these ways. And it also shows the link, which I think is a really critical part of really kind of moving trauma responsive work forward, is showing how mindfulness, as an example. So there are a number of schools now that have implemented, a mindful moment, or, a jumping jack minute, or like movement in the classroom. They're implementing a thing and everybody's adopted it. That's great. And people are seeing results. Fantastic. Make sure that you're helping everyone around you see how the thing that's working is impacting these other indicators. Keeping a young person being able to manage their body so they can stay in their seat and pay attention to the amazing free and public education that's already being offered is great. That's an academic outcome, that's an attendance outcome, that's trauma responsive outcome, there's behavioral indicators. You can multitask these trauma responsive strategies and show how they contribute in all these different ways. And this is one of the tools that I really like that does that. Again, if you're in a school and you're working with a school, there are pervasive kind of driving goals, aims, performance measures, things that everybody's watching. How are our test scores going to go up? Are we, is this one thing going to happen? Everybody's focused on that. Terrific. Let's layer things on top of that and help. And we can align these things because they really do all connect. Other sources of strategies. So we mentioned this a little bit during our introductory session, but the TASN, the School Mental Health Initiative, this is coming out of Kansas, has a number of really incredible resources, similar to kind of the tool I just shared from Wisconsin, organized in different ways that align across different kinds of initiatives, different performance measures and indicators, a lot of really, really great stuff in this resource database. There are a number of these kinds of resource databases. TASN is a great one. There are a lot of them. And so again, they're now databases of strategies. I mean, it's the issue though with the Google problem, right? Like I can Google and learn how to do something, but it's going to give me like 3 million responses. And so nobody has the time to go through and evaluate and weed out the stuff that is clearly, not evidence informed. And so that's one of the ways that these kinds of resource databases can be very helpful is, if you can get a little bit of a head start, someone else has done some of the legwork to review stuff, to kind of weed out the stuff that's totally out there, that's not feasible, that's not legal, whatever the thing is. They've taken out some of what you get in a Google search and they've organized it in a way that makes it more accessible. Fantastic. Start there with these kinds of pieces. TASN is one of those places. TASN also has a lot of great, and connected to the School Mental Health Initiative in general, a lot of great resources. I still work with a number of school professionals who, once we come up with, they come up with an idea, oh, we want to do X, this is the approach we want to take. Immediately, they're opening up and literally building the thing themselves. So, oh, we want to collect these data, let's make a form. Oh, we want to do this program, let's make it up. It'll have these 5 components and we'll have a dinosaur puppet. Great. Those are all fantastic things. And if somebody has the time and energy and capacity to make these things up from scratch each time, I think that's incredible. And please send us pictures and we will celebrate it. Most of us don't have the time or the energy or the resources or the capacity to make things up all the way from scratch all the time. And so that's where kind of getting a head start in any of these ways with any of these tools is a great place to launch, and then knowing that you can always adapt it, right? And so you can always shift it so it makes sense. Shift it and make it into your school colors. Fantastic. Change the mascot so it matches yours. Love it. Like these are ways that we can adapt things so they feel more personalized without actually having to do all the legwork of building something from the ground up. Okay, so looking at time, we're at 11. We are perfectly on time. Okay, so there are a lot of great resources out there, and I love resources. This is probably I put this up there with like the hand model of things to tuck away, to keep, and to consider using in the future. So this is I call it the rubric, but it's a review tool, and it came out of Wisconsin, so that same body of work where they've been doing, having lots of conversations around trauma. And this is actually a pretty old tool that's been around for a while. So I think we're going into like 15 years. And it's something that I've shared often, and I would encourage you to consider using it. So what it is this rubric, and I'm going to actually open up the whole document here. Okay, so this is what the whole tool looks like. So the rubric actually goes across 2 pages. That's an important thing to remember. What you'll see here on the left is what they're calling this TIC value, so trauma-informed care value. Don't get caught up in the acronym or the language. These are the SAMHSA values that we talked about, the 5 principles organized here. So safety, trustworthiness, collaboration, choice, empowerment. And essentially, this is a rubric that can be used in lots of different ways. But essentially, it's a way to assess, to consider, to brainstorm around any program, practice, policy, procedure, and kind of to look at it and say, like what's going well, what's not going well, how trauma informed is it, or how trauma responsive is it? And I see this much more as a brainstorming tool. I've seen this work really, really well with groups. So if there's a team, I've seen teams that aren't focused on trauma use something like this if they're implementing something new, or maybe there's a strategy or a practice they've had in place that was working and does not seem to be working. And so kind of what's going on with it. It's just a way to kind of get the juices flowing and to look at a thing from all these different angles. So we're going to delve in here in a second, and Evelyn and I are going to kind of talk through some practices and kind of what that looks like. I do want to highlight that on the third page, there is this list of kind of this common view versus trauma-informed view. And so this is showing kind of what a trauma-informed school might look like, and what maybe what things look like now. When I read this now, it feels a little bit outdated. So when we look at like the common view, I don't see as much of the common view in, among schools and with professionals that I work with, but some of it is still around. And absolutely, there are still specific policies, practices, procedures, programs that really are built on or connected to this common view. More punitive, more about power and control, definitely the adults in charge, those kinds of pieces. And then the comparison of like what it would look like if it were trauma informed. This kind of side-by-side comparison I have found to be very helpful. If it's not this, just kind of doing a side-by-side comparison to really help folks understand, or maybe kind of really to bring it home, what it would look like if something were different. And so often, I don't know, but like I regularly kind of get this feedback of, yep, Melissa, like we love trauma informed everything. You sold it. And what does it look like? What does it look like in practice? If I walked into a classroom, how would I know from what I'm looking at that this might be a classroom that is trauma informed? How would I know that this practice is trauma informed or not? You're saying everything is trauma informed, but nothing is. Like, how do I know? Right? And this rubric, I feel like, is one way to look at it and to kind of consider the different aspects. So scrolling up. So again, we have the different values. We have kind of what it would look like or sound like if the practice or policy of the thing that we're talking about is trauma informed, trauma sensitive, trauma responsive, kind of a consistency rating. So like, how much is this consistent with kind of how people might respond? And then if possible, citing evidence to support it. I've seen people use this to develop entire, district improvement plan tracking systems of like, okay, we are here, we want to be here, we're collecting student survey data, we're going to use this point. So it can be very kind of systematic and continuous quality improvement-ish. It can also just be a conversation, which is how I've found it to be the most useful. So Evelyn, do you have a strategy or anything that you want to talk about here? And I have some ideas if you don't have one off the top of your head.
I'd love to go with your ideas. I wanted two things that you shared when we were talking about this that really helped me get my mind around it was what you said about it's more a conversation starter and bringing groups together. And then you also reinforced that it's more aspirational. No one has a 5 on everything. So I just wanted to share that, that when you explained that, it helped me understand better.
Fantastic. Yes, absolutely. There is no finish line, like, and everybody wins. Everybody already won. Everybody already got the gold medal. So like we're there, and that it is it's intended to be more of a discussion point. Okay, so let's think about a practice. So the trick, if you're starting to do this with a team, is that you want to go through some examples. You want to focus on things that are small. This is not talking about your entire behavior management plan. This is not kind of a whole school, whole community initiative. Those are too big and you're going to get really stuck in different pieces. It's easiest if you pick on something very, very, very small first, especially as you're kind of learning how to use it. And also, if you kind of identify something that doesn't seem to really have a lot to do with trauma, and kind of focusing on that. So let's do this, so this comes from real life experience, so we can kind of play it through, and then I can tell you kind of how this went. So I was working, this was a few years ago, working with a school and a specific classroom teacher, middle school, who had a very clear process for how students should turn in work. And so they had the whole thing. They had the levels and the different, places to put things for different subjects and different names. And it was a beautiful procedure. I mean, I could have walked in and immediately picked it up and known where I should put my work to be completed. And they had used it for years, the procedure and all the tools and the things, but they had moved classrooms and they'd set up their whole station. And then all of a sudden it wasn't working. So whereas before students could be taught the process and the procedure for turning in work, and they would practice it, they'd walk through it, she did all of those things. And then all of a sudden, it worked for a little bit, and then it just kind of started falling apart. And so let's kind of look at that. So it wasn't working. There was a thing that she was doing, it wasn't working. So let's talk through some of these things and see if we can identify maybe some potential places. And Evelyn, you can ask me more questions as we go through about kind of details, and then I'll tell you. So let's start with safety. Okay, so this turning in your work procedure, does it show that you will listen to my history without judging me? I mean, I think so. I don't see how it really applies. I don't, it's their names on it. It doesn't necessarily have anything to do with their history. So I'm going to say that's maybe not all that helpful. Let's see. Trustworthiness. This practice recognizes trust is something that is earned over time. So I may not tell you the truth until our relationship is established. So trust. So Eva, what might that look like? What might we look at or consider or question when it comes to trust? I like the second bullet too. It shows you understand I may test our relationship, because in the past, I've had difficulty trusting people. What does trust have to do with how we turn in papers in class?
I mean, what's running through my mind is more kind of some fear around how good my work's going to be, or do I feel comfortable and trust you not to judge me, or not to be accepting of how I'm seeing it.
Yeah, no, I love it. And so Evelyn, I don't know what you actually did in your mind, but my guess is that you were kind of imagining like a young person walking up to this, not very well described place where you turn in the work, and like what that young person might be feeling, right? So this is middle school, 7th grade teacher, kind of thinking what's going on in 7th grade, just getting out of your seat and doing anything in front of other people can be scary. That can be scary for us as adults. And then also that relationship then between the student and the teacher, like if I turn this in, like, are you going to give me a fair shot? Are you going to believe that I did the work? What if I maybe did not do the work in the past? Are you going to believe it there? Like all these things around trust. Can I trust you to judge me fairly, to consider me as a human? All of those pieces coming into play. I love it. What about, let's see, collaboration. So collaboration. This procedure shows we will work together to create a plan to help me learn skills rather than you telling me what the plan is to change my behavior. So how might that connect here? What might we consider around that?
Just when you're saying it wasn't working, it does make me wonder, is it something that there was some student or end user feedback about how's that working for the student?
Yeah, and so absolutely. And so collaboration, I would say that even that there was a conversation around this procedure not working shows actually a high level of collaborative willingness for the teacher, probably for the students, that somehow we figured out that it's not working, and an adult is asking for help, which is, that shows a lot of things that are existing. That shows a lot of strength, actually. They're like, whoa, here's this procedure. I'm recognizing that this thing is not working anymore. Like, what is happening? I need help. And absolutely that, maybe something went off, something's different here. Before this worked, now it didn't. I might wonder if, like, how did this procedure come about in the first place? So was this something that before had been developed collaboratively in the classroom? So is this something that the teacher said, hey, we need a better, easier way to turn in work, and then talked to students over time? Had this evolved actually? And so we're hearing about it as if it was set in stone, the same exact thing for 20 years, and then all of a sudden it didn't work. And that maybe that's not true. Maybe it did actually evolve over time, and there is an element of participation by the classroom. And so I might ask things like, is it the same in every classroom? Is the issue the same in every classroom? 7th grade, they're changing periods, right? So like, if this is a procedure, how does this work across classrooms? And is it just this one, or is it all of them? Like, I'm getting really curious about, like, what is different between what was happening and what is happening now. Okay, choice, empowerment. Okay, so choice. This procedure recognizes a one-size-fits-all approach can make me feel discounted. And I can think of all kinds of ways that probably at that point would have already been considered just visually. But when I read that, immediately I think, like, what this procedure for turning in work, like, physically, what does it look like? And this is absolutely the point where I said, okay, you need to take me to your classroom and show me, like, physically show me your classroom and walk me through the whole thing. Because the first thing that I would have thought of is, can somebody physically not get there? Like, is this potentially like a ability issue? Like, do you have someone who is, using some sort, are they in a wheelchair? Can they not reach the space? Do they have to reach really high? And then all of a sudden I'm thinking, like, 7th grade, we're adolescents on stage. We always think that people are watching us. Like, when I reach up to turn the stuff in, is my back showing? Like, what is it about this? And so, like, I went to this friend's classroom and actually walked through, and, like, I leaned down and I was like, what physically is happening here? Because something is tricky here.
In that same vein, just with social anxiety in students who may have more behavioral health concerns, might be similar to some of the concerns that you're mentioning.
Okay, so here's your first hint. So the actual thing we think had to do with safety. So does this procedure show that you value my emotional and physical safety, even if it means you have to change your usual approach? So what other kinds of questions do you have, Evelyn, about what this look like? So, like, if we're trying to paint a picture of, like, what this, there's boxes, there's shelves, bins, handed in. So, like, what other questions might you have about, like, physically how this is set up in a classroom?
Yeah, when you do it, like you were saying, the where you do it, are the kind of the instructions of how to do it, and kind of meeting students where they're at across language and behavioral and physical needs.
Absolutely. And so all those things. And when we get down to this point and we brainstormed all these things that could potentially be the reason why this isn't working anymore, it also highlights how many things this teacher was doing well to make this work at all. And it also helps me appreciate that anybody has a work turn-in procedure that actually works, because it's impossible. Like, this is really hard. Like, there are so many things that can go wrong. So when I physically went to this teacher's classroom, I walked in. So there is one entrance to this classroom, and there are windows along the back wall. And she walked me through the entire thing. And I walked through it, and I, kind of to learn about it. But what she had done and what we had realized is that the station to turn in work was in the back corner of the classroom. And to turn in the work, the student had to physically turn their back to the open door. They looked out the windows, but they're turning their back to the only single exit to the classroom. And then they had to turn back around and go back to their seat. And so the teacher actually thought that it had to do with the students who were sitting near the turn-in station. They had thoughts about the social aspects. So maybe some people are just nervous. This is anxiety. There's different components. But in the end, when we walked through it, and she walked over, and so I said, why don't you do this, right? And so then while you're standing there with your back towards the door, the only exit from this space, do you feel good or do you not feel good? And she was like, I feel awful. This doesn't, I can't. And then she turned around. And so she was in the spot in the classroom where there's the most danger, the furthest away from, the door, second floor classroom. She couldn't jump out the window, right? And so then all of a sudden you're turning your back to the exit. So this, in that moment, is likely among the most vulnerable places that a person could physically be safety-wise. And it's the time that they are the most likely, all humans between them and the exit. And so we guessed that maybe that was it. She moved the turn-in station up closer to the front door. She made it so students would not have to turn their back either to the whole class or her or the exit. And then we saw and tried to figure out what was happening. And it was resolved. And lo and behold, she took me back to her other classroom and said, this is where it was before. And it was in exactly the spot that she ended up moving it back to. She just had never considered that, wow, the actual movement of going to the back, that it felt that scary. And so those are the kinds of things that who would have thought I wouldn't have. Why isn't this working? I would have gone into Pinterest. Why don't you make different colors? Name them animals. Let's come up with some fun. But this wasn't a task to be bulletin boarded, right? This was a task to look at physically, proximity wise, where things are. And I think that this question of physical safety and feelings of physical safety, especially now, when schools and everything that's happened in terms of school violence, is something to consider. That people are looking at desks, and it's not just a desk to write on and to learn with, it's a desk that they can hide behind. If there's an active shooter, these are things that we should be considering as we're looking at, wow, here's this thing that did work and it's not working, or here's how to set this kind of thing up. So Evelyn, do you have thoughts, critiques? And if folks have questions, I would love, that was, and I don't even know that we used this rubric when we were brainstorming through this, but looking back on it, I'm like, oh, this is a good application here.
I just think what you said, physically walking through it, it reminds me of our clinic. And so being that secret shopper who walks through every step that your patient or student, it's such good advice.
It is also easier to give than to take, right? And
yes,
so,
for sure.
And this, again, I want to really praise the teacher in this instance for being willing to ask for help, and also being willing to, because it's one of those things that once you know it, but until you think of it, it just doesn't occur to you. And why would it? Why in the world would you why would you? And so the willingness to try new things, to move things around, and to consider that, and to see, let's just see what happens. I will also tell you that for every one of those situations where there is kind of this relatively easy, quick kind of sort of let's move it up here and see what happens. For every one of those, there are, at least 10 where it took many, 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 many more tries to figure out what the thing was that was really challenging, right? But they were all the same process of, okay, let's look at the thing and try to understand the thing and what's happening. And then let's use these questions to kind of consider these different aspects. Do folks have questions, thoughts, concerns, critiques?
I might ask you one question. One thing that was going through my mind was so much can come down to social determinants of health, and how some students, is it just not giving them that equal chance to do some of the things? I guess, could you comment on how social determinants of health might figure in?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think, I think that this particular rubric, and I have to look through it in a whole lot of detail. I think that it kind of addresses social determinants, but it's pretty vague. So this choice one where it talks about being uncomfortable, respect. I mean, it's this one size fits all. You know, there's a way that I think social determinants, I could argue, is baked into some of this, but I think that with social determinants in particular, it can be helpful to like call that out separately. So how does access to affordable, stable housing affect a student's ability to turn in paper in the corner of the room? What's the relationship here, Melissa? Okay, so great question. I will accept that challenge. So access to affordable housing and stability, stable housing means that I have the same place to go. That's a consistent and predictable routine. It also means that I likely have stable access to things like a shower. I can, be clean. This becomes a huge issue, right? I mean, and it's a huge issue for a number of ages, and of course, for like middle school, like this is when if I am a smelly child because I don't have access to be clean, like I am really going to start to get some social pressure around that. And so absolutely does it connect for sure. And just having that consideration, I think a lot of it comes down to this acknowledgement that all of us are unique and all of us have this very unique set of opportunities and challenges. Some of us have access to resources and some of us don't. And so kind of figuring out like how do we set up a context where we're trying to give young people as many opportunities to succeed as possible. And so, you know what, if this friend is having a hard time, getting their clothes clean to come to school, let's talk that through. If we can't help them get their clothes clean to come to school, what considerations might we have? How might we, that would come into, okay, as a grade level, we are going to adopt this language. If someone says something like, you stink, okay, collectively, as a group of teachers and administrators, here's going to be our patent response. It's connected to our, stated expectations. We respect other individuals. So if one kid said to another, you stink, we might ignore it first because that's our practice. The second time we might, and so that's what that looks like. Is like this is a specific challenge. We want to show respect. If someone says this over and over again, we need to acknowledge it out loud and be clear that this does not align with our value, that we respect each other. What is the benefit of telling this friend that they stink? They know that they stink. That's not helping anybody. It's not helping them learn. It's not helping me learn. It's not helping any of us do anything better. What does it do? And if it's not building our community, then what's the point, right? And let's make other choices. And so it's coming up. And I've absolutely seen teachers do this. Sit down and say, how do we what's our language? What is the language we are going to use to collectively respond? Similarly, with like the idea around suicide and addressing suicidal ideation and any comment about suicide, it's a similar kind of idea that if this happens, then we will all collectively do this thing. And that's, I think, part of how we start to even the playing field is by acknowledging that we have power in these situations. And we can say, we built this community as a community of learners, we are going to do these things. And this comment does not align with this. And this is a time that I'm going to bring, my role as an adult in to address these different pieces. But I think part of it is just at the outset, just considering it, that it's even a thing. And also making sure that we are taking the responsibility we can as the grownups to do what we can about it. I might not be able to build this friend a house. I can't do that. There are other pieces I can do, but like what I can do is make sure that when these learners are in my space, that I have, some role in kind of setting what it looks like in this space and what our community is, that this is how we are going to treat people and getting out in front of that. I don't know if that, I may be really excited about like taking this and adapting it for social determinants to call it out more specifically, which sounds like a great thing for us to do.
Yeah, thank you. What you said with the example, that was really helpful.
Good. Okay, so we have about 6 minutes left. And so here's the thing. So we are going to shift back to the presentation and wrap up. This kind of conversation is exactly the kind of conversation we would love to have more of with you. If you have questions, concerns, if you are listening to this and you're like, this makes no sense, Melissa, like you got to pitch it again, I don't get it, please let us know. And because we want this to make sense and to be useful. And so we can talk this through, look at other examples, find different tools. Again, that's what we're here for, is to try to be helpful, and to give this information away. It's not secret, it's not proprietary. Take whatever is useful, use it, and be well, for sure. Okay, so key takeaways from today, hopefully. So tears, not tears. I really am impressed with myself on this one, but so tears, not tears. This idea of using a tiered model for trauma responsive schools. And I see a whole lot of folks doing this really, really well. And maybe you are in your journey to strengthen your context for learning, to use a tiered model. Do not forget that foundational tier, and give yourself a lot of credit, because it's your due. All the credit, take all the wins, celebrate the successes, but think about this in a tiered model. Consider kind of whole school, whole community approaches, and something like psychological first aid. The fine print at the bottom, PFA is different than mental health first aid. And then this final piece, effective trauma responsive strategies are absolutely about the science. So we want to start with something that we think has a good chance of working. That's just smart, right? So it is about the science. It's also about the art. And implementation is hard. Changing adult behavior is hard. Changing our own behavior, changing any behavior is hard. And so, yes, it's about the science piece, but here I'd say lean heavier on the human piece. Bring the human to change and evolution in communities. And don't forget about that part. It's all about relationships, right? It's about humans humaning with other humans. And that's a critical piece of that. Okay, so Christy, we have about 5 minutes left. I am going to see if anybody has questions, comments, concerns, ideas. Thank you, Matt. Thanks, Carolyn. Love it. Any questions? Feel free to unmute if you want to. Okay. Christy, I'm going to hand it back to you.
All right, thanks, Melissa and Evelyn, for all of the information and the resources that you shared, and thanks everybody for joining us today. This is the last session in this two-part series. There's a survey in your inbox right now, and we'd love to get your feedback on this trauma responsive schools training. And we just to say, we really do use the responses. We go through the feedback, and so it is really valuable. We do look at it, and we'd love to get your responses on that. We will send the presentation and the recording and the certificates of attendance to you just as soon as we've got them processed. So watch your email this week for those. And then as we develop new trainings, we'll be sure to send the invitations your way. We've got some ideas in planning right now for topics this fall related to classroom behavior and keeping kids safe.